I always thought our marriage was strong. Bonnie and I had been together for nearly a decade, raising two amazing kids and building a life that, from the outside, seemed unshakable. But looking back, I realize now that the signs of trouble were there. I just wasn't ready to see them. It started with subtle changes. Bonnie, who used to be so present, seemed distracted. She was glued to her phone, texting late at night with a smile she didn't share with me. When I asked who it was, she'd laugh it off, saying it was just a friend from work. I tried to brush it aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then there were the sudden work trips, the unexplained absences, and her growing impatience whenever I asked about her day. A small voice in the back of my mind started whispering what I didn't want to hear. Something wasn't right. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a message from Rich, my sister Susan's husband. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My hands shook as I stared at the message, my mind racing. How could she do this? And with him of all people? I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I started paying attention, really paying attention, to the little details I had ignored for months. The late-night calls, the way she avoided my gaze, the faint whiff of cologne that wasn't mine when she hugged me goodnight. I wasn't ready to face the truth, but the evidence was piling up, and I knew I couldn't ignore it much longer. The truth was like a storm cloud hanging over me, dark and unrelenting. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every moment I spent in the same room with Bonnie felt suffocating. I wanted to confront her, but I needed more than a single text message to confirm what my gut already knew. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I started small, casually asking her questions about her day. Her answers were vague, rehearsed. Work was fine, she'd say, or just had a meeting with the team. Her words felt like wallpaper, trying to cover up cracks that were becoming too obvious to ignore. I began to notice patterns. Her so-called work trips coincided with times when Rich would also mysteriously be unavailable. I started tracking her behavior, an innocent enough move at first. I checked her calendar, noticed when she left the house, and even paid attention to her wardrobe. Bonnie, who once only wore sweats and t-shirts to errands, was suddenly dressing like she was going to a dinner party just to grab groceries. The breaking point came one Friday evening when Bonnie announced, out of the blue, that she had a late-night meeting. It was unusual. Bonnie's job rarely required her to stay past 6. My stomach churned, and I knew I couldn't let her walk out the door without doing something. That night, I followed her. My heart was racing as I sat in my car, a block away from a dimly lit apartment building I'd never seen before. Bonnie's car was parked outside, and a few minutes later, Rich arrived. They didn't even try to be discreet. He kissed her on the cheek before they walked inside together, laughing. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door they disappeared into, wondering how my life had unraveled so quickly. A part of me wanted to burst inside and demand answers, but another part felt frozen, unwilling to face the reality that would follow. When I finally drove home, I couldn't stop crying. The betrayal was so sharp it felt physical, like a knife twisting in my chest. I knew there was no going back from this moment. The foundation of our marriage wasn't just cracked, it was shattered. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. If Bonnie wanted to tear apart everything we'd built, then I was going to uncover the truth and take control of what came next. The next morning, I could barely look at her. Bonnie carried on like nothing had happened, humming to herself as she prepared breakfast. The normalcy of it all enraged me. How could she act so unaffected while I was drowning in the weight of her betrayal? I waited until the kids were out of the house. At least they wouldn't have to witness this. When the door closed behind them, I turned to Bonnie, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I know about you and Rich." Her body went rigid. The spatula in her hand clattered to the floor, and she slowly turned to face me. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights, but then her expression shifted into something cold and defensive. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes darting, searching for a way out. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. I followed you last night. I saw you with him. Her face drained of color, and for a brief second, I thought she might break down and confess. Instead, she crossed her arms and shot back. So you're spying on me now? Is that what we've come to? Her deflection stung, but I wasn't about to let her turn this around on me. Don't even try to make this about me. You've been lying to me, to our family, for God knows how long. How long has this been going on, Bonnie? She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. It's not what you think, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't lie to me again, I snapped. I saw the way you were with him. I've seen the texts. Just tell me the truth for once. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity before finally exhaling, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the lie had become too heavy to carry. It started a few months ago, she admitted. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand how she could be so careless, so selfish. Instead, I just stood there numb. Why? I asked, my voice breaking. Why would you do this to us? To me? To the kids? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with tears. I don't know, Rob. I was unhappy. I felt lost. And Rich. He was there and you thought sleeping with my sister's husband was the solution? I cut her off, my anger finally boiling over. Do you even understand what you've done? To us? To Susan? To our kids? She started to cry, but I didn't feel sympathy. Not yet. Her tears couldn't undo the damage, couldn't erase the betrayal. I walked out of the kitchen and into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. For hours, I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying the conversation in my head. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built my life with, was a stranger to me now, and I wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. One thing was clear, though. Our marriage would never be the same. Part 4. The emotional fallout. That night was one of the longest of my life. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling every emotion possible. Anger, sadness, humiliation, even a strange sense of guilt. Had I failed her in some way? Was there something I could have done to prevent this? But every time I started to blame myself, the image of her walking into that apartment with Rich came crashing back into my mind. No, this wasn't my fault. This was her choice. The next morning, I couldn't even look at her. She tried to talk to me, but I shut her down. I need time, I told her. Don't talk to me unless it's about the kids. She nodded, tears in her eyes, but I didn't care. I couldn't afford to care. Not yet. I spent the day going through the motions, trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to everything that had happened. The betrayal felt like a living, breathing thing, following me around, suffocating me. When the kids came home, I put on a brave face, but they could sense something was wrong. Is everything okay, Dad? My daughter asked, her big eyes filled with concern. I forced a smile and nodded. Everything's fine, sweetheart. But it wasn't fine, and I wasn't sure it ever would be again. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Bonnie tried to talk to me again. She apologized over and over, but her words felt hollow. I didn't want apologies. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand why she would throw away everything we had for a man who was supposed to be family. But deep down, I knew that no answer she gave would ever be enough. That night, the silence in the house was deafening. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage, trying to pinpoint where things had gone so wrong. The betrayal felt like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, raw and exposed, leaving me vulnerable in ways I never thought possible. The hardest part was the anger. It consumed me. It wasn't just directed at Bonnie, but at myself too. How could I have missed the signs? How could I have trusted her so completely? And then there was the shame. I couldn't stop picturing the moment when Susan, my sister, would find out what her husband had done. It was a betrayal that cut so deep, it was almost impossible to comprehend. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, but even that was unbearable. Every photo of Bonnie and me, smiling and happy, felt like a lie. Every memory we'd built together seemed tainted, ruined by her choices. The next morning, I couldn't face her. She tried to talk to me, her voice soft, hesitant, but I brushed past her, pretending I didn't hear. I knew we'd have to have a conversation eventually, but not yet. I wasn't ready. The kids, of course, sensed that something was wrong. My daughter asked if I was okay, her big, innocent eyes searching my face for answers I couldn't give her. I managed a weak smile and told her everything was fine, but I could tell she didn't believe me. I spent the rest of the day going through the motions, pretending to work while my mind spiraled. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was about the destruction of trust, the loss of the person I thought I could always rely on. By the time the sun set, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew one thing for certain. It wouldn't look anything like the life I had imagined with Bonnie. The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance. Bonnie tried several times to start a conversation, but I shut her down each time. I wasn't ready to talk, and I didn't trust myself not to explode. I needed space to think, space to feel, and space to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. But avoidance couldn't last forever. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Bonnie cornered me in the kitchen. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy from crying. "Rob," she started, her voice trembling, "we need to talk. Please, just listen." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Fine," I said coldly. "Talk." She took a deep breath, and for a moment, it looked like she might crumble. "I know I've hurt you, and I can't take back what I've done," she said. "But I need you to understand, it wasn't about you. It was about me." I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions of being a wife and a mother, and I didn't know how to tell you. Her words stung, but not in the way I expected. Invisible? Had she really felt that way? And why hadn't she told me sooner? I wanted to lash out, to tell her that her excuses didn't justify what she'd done. But instead, I just stared at her, my emotions a mix of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite define. "You could have talked to me," I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended. "You could have told me how you were feeling. But instead, you went to him. You betrayed me, Bonnie. You betrayed all of us." She started crying, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But please, Rob, I don't want to lose everything. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something, pity, maybe, or a distant echo of the love we once shared. But it was quickly drowned out by the weight of her betrayal. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix," I said, my voice firm. "You've broken something that can't be undone, and I need time to figure out what that means for me, for us." She nodded, tears still falling, and left the room without another word. I stayed in the kitchen long after she was gone, staring out the window into the darkness, trying to piece together the fragments of my life. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't let this destroy me. I needed to focus on what mattered most, my kids, my future, and my own sense of self-worth. Whatever happened with Bonnie, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her choices define me. After that conversation, I felt a temporary sense of control, like I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. But there was still so much left unanswered. Bonnie's vague apology didn't satisfy me. I needed the full truth, and I wasn't going to rely on her version of it. I decided to start digging. It wasn't something I felt proud of, but I knew I couldn't make clear decisions about our future without understanding the full scope of what had happened. If she wouldn't give me the answers, I would find them myself. The first place I turned was her phone. While Bonnie was out running errands, I unlocked it using the code I'd memorized months ago, back when we still trusted each other. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages, searching for the proof I already knew I'd find. It didn't take long. There were entire threads between her and Rich, messages filled with inside jokes, flirtation, and plans for meetups. My stomach churned as I read them, the words blurring together in my growing rage. One message in particular stood out. "Last night was perfect. I wish we didn't have to hide this." Perfect. That's how she described betraying me and her own family. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to keep reading. The messages detailed their rendezvous, excuses they gave to their spouses, and even plans for a weekend trip together. It wasn't just a fling. It was a carefully orchestrated affair. Then I found something else, a receipt for an apartment rental. My jaw tightened as I realized they had a secret place, a sanctuary for their lies. That was where they had been meeting, the same apartment I'd seen them enter that night. It wasn't just the emotional betrayal that gutted me. It was the effort they put into hiding it. Bonnie hadn't just slipped up. She had made calculated choices to deceive me over and over again. Later that evening, I started gathering other evidence. I combed through our bank accounts, credit card statements, and even her social media activity. I pieced together a timeline of her deceit, finding expenses that lined up with her lies. When I was done, I had a pile of irrefutable proof, screenshots of messages, financial records, and even a record of her late-night calls to Rich. It was enough to confront her, and more than enough to protect myself if this went to court. The weight of it all was overwhelming, but I felt a strange sense of resolve. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore. It was about ensuring that I wouldn't be the one left picking up the pieces of her reckless choices. I had to think about my kids, my own future, and how to minimize the damage her betrayal could inflict on all of us. For the first time since I discovered the affair, I felt prepared. If Bonnie thought she could lie her way through this, she was in for a rude awakening. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. The evidence sat on my desk for 2 days before I worked up the courage to confront Bonnie again. This time, there would be no vague apologies or half-truths. She couldn't talk her way out of what I had uncovered. I waited until the kids were asleep, the house quiet and still. Bonnie was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone when I walked in with a folder of evidence. She looked up at me, her face already wary. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. Her eyes darted to the folder in my hands, and she visibly tensed. "What's that?" "It's the truth," I said, dropping it on the coffee table in front of her. "I've spent the past few days putting it together. Messages, receipts, phone records. Everything you and Rich thought you could keep hidden." Bonnie's face went pale as she opened the folder. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. For a moment, I thought she might deny it again, but when she looked up at me, her expression was one of defeat. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly, her voice laced with something that almost sounded like resentment. "Yes, I did," I shot back. "Because you weren't going to tell me the truth. And now I know everything. I know about the apartment, the trips, the lies. So don't even try to pretend this wasn't what it looks like." She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "How long, Bonnie? How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then finally said, 6 months. 6 months. Half a year of lies, half a year of sneaking around behind my back. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. "And you didn't think to stop?" "Not once." I asked, my voice rising. "Did you even think about what this would do to me? To the kids? To Susan?" Tears streamed down her face, but I wasn't moved. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I just—" "Stop," I interrupted. "I don't want to hear excuses. I want to know what you plan to do now, because this is over. You've destroyed everything we had, Bonnie. There's no coming back from this." She started to sob, her face buried in her hands. But I felt nothing, no sympathy, no urge to comfort her. I was too angry, too betrayed. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said, my tone cold and detached. "We have a prenuptial agreement, remember? Infidelity changes everything. You'll get 20% of what we built, and that's it. I'm not letting you take more from me than you already have." Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face contorted with shock. "Rob, please," she begged. "Don't do this. We can work through this. I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes." I shook my head, standing my ground. "It's too late for that. You should have thought about this before you decided to cheat. I'm done." I turned and walked away, leaving her sobbing on the couch. My heart felt heavy, but for the first time in weeks, I also felt a sense of clarity. This was the beginning of the end, and I was finally ready to face it. The days after that confrontation were surreal. Bonnie and I barely spoke unless it was about the kids. She moved to the guest room, and the house felt colder, quieter, as if her betrayal had sucked the warmth out of everything. I threw myself into work, not because I had a passion for it, but because I needed a distraction. Every time I stopped, even for a moment, my mind filled with images of her and Rich, laughing, sneaking around, lying to all of us. It was unbearable, but avoidance only worked for so long. One evening, Susan called. She sounded cheerful, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit her life. My stomach churned as I realized I couldn't keep this from her any longer. She deserved to know the truth. "Susan," I said, interrupting her mid-sentence, "I need to tell you something, and it's not going to be easy to hear." There was a pause on the line, and when she spoke again, her tone was wary. "What is it, Rob? You're scaring me." I took a deep breath and told her everything. The affair, the evidence, the timeline. I didn't leave anything out. By the time I finished, Susan was silent, and I could hear her breathing shakily on the other end. "Rich," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're saying my husband, Rich, did this? With Bonnie?" "Yes," I said, my heart heavy. "I'm so sorry, Susan." Her sobs hit me like a punch to the gut. Susan was strong, always the rock of our family. But now she sounded broken, shattered by the same betrayal that had wrecked my life. "I need to see it," she said suddenly. "The proof. I need to see everything." "I'll bring it to you," I promised. The next day, I drove to her house with a folder of evidence. Susan sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes, and I could see the mix of anger and pain on her face. When I handed her the folder, she opened it with trembling hands. As she flipped through the pages, her expression darkened, her lips pressed into a thin line. "How could he do this?" she muttered, more to herself than to me. "How could they both do this?" "I wish I had an answer," I said softly, sitting across from her. "But I don't. All I know is that we didn't deserve this." For hours, we talked, sharing our heartbreak, our anger, and our confusion. By the end of the conversation, we had made a pact. We wouldn't let Bonnie and Rich control the narrative. We would protect our kids, fight for what was ours, and hold them accountable for their actions. Driving home that night, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since discovering the affair, I didn't feel completely alone. Susan and I were in this together, and together we would find a way to rebuild the pieces of our lives. But deep down, I knew the hardest part was yet to come. The kids had picked up on the tension long before either of us was ready to admit it to them. It's impossible to hide something this big, especially when the very foundation of a family is crumbling. My daughter, Emily, was the first to ask outright. "Dad," she said one evening as I tucked her into bed, "why aren't you and Mom talking? Did something bad happen?" Her question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. She was only 13, old enough to sense when something was wrong, but still too young to fully understand the weight of what had happened. "It's complicated, sweetheart," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But just know that whatever happens, your mom and I both love you and your brother very much. None of this is your fault." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "You're not getting divorced, are you?" I swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. "We're figuring things out," I said finally. "I promise you'll always be taken care of." That seemed to satisfy her for the moment, but I could see the worry in her eyes as I kissed her goodnight. A few days later, it was my son, Jake, who approached me. At 16, he was quieter than Emily, but his silence carried a weight of its own. "I know something's going on," he said bluntly, cornering me in the garage where I'd been pretending to fix something. "You and Mom don't even look at each other anymore. Is it about Rich?" The mention of Rich's name stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Jake hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "Emily and I, we've been watching," he admitted. "Mom's been acting weird for months, and we saw her with him. We followed her once. We didn't want to believe it, but we saw them together." My heart sank. I had tried so hard to shield the kids from this mess, but they had already been pulled into it. "You followed her?" I asked, my voice a mix of disbelief and concern. "We just wanted to know the truth," Jake said, his expression defiant. "We figured if we had proof, you wouldn't just, I don't know, brush it off. We wanted to help." I didn't know whether to be angry or grateful. They shouldn't have had to take on this burden, but their determination to stand by me was undeniable. "What did you find?" I asked softly, bracing myself for the answer. Jake showed me photos and videos they had taken. Bonnie and Rich meeting at the apartment, laughing together, looking far too comfortable for two people who should have been ashamed of themselves. The kids had even gone as far as tracking her phone location and noting her spending habits. "It's not fair," Jake said, his voice cracking. "How could she do this to us?" "To you?" "To Aunt Susan." I put a hand on his shoulder, trying to steady both of us. "You shouldn't have had to carry this," I said, my voice heavy with guilt. "I'm so sorry, Jake." "It's not your fault, Dad," he said firmly. "But we want to help. Whatever you need, we'll do it. We're on your side." Hearing those words broke something in me. For weeks, I had felt so alone, like the weight of Bonnie's betrayal was mine to bear alone. But now, I realized I wasn't the only one fighting this battle. My kids were stronger than I gave them credit for, and they were standing with me, ready to face whatever came next. I hugged Jake tightly, letting the tears I'd been holding back finally fall. "We'll get through this," I said, more to myself than to him. "We'll figure it out. Together." That night, for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that even in the darkest moments, family could still be a source of strength. While I wrestled with my own emotions and tried to protect my children, Susan was dealing with her own nightmare. After I shared the evidence with her, she went silent for a few days. I didn't push her. I knew she needed time to process everything. But when she finally called me, her voice was steely, a stark contrast to the broken woman I'd spoken to before. "Rob, I've made up my mind," she said. I could hear the resolve in her voice, but I still asked, "What are you going to do?" "I'm divorcing him," she said flatly. "There's no coming back from this. He didn't just betray me. He betrayed our family, our children. I won't let him stay in our lives after what he's done." Her decision didn't surprise me, but it still hit hard. I knew how much Susan had loved Rich, how much trust she had placed in him. Hearing her say the words made it all the more real. "I'm so sorry, Susan," I said. "I wish I could have spared you from this." "It's not your fault," she said. "But now we have to think about what comes next. The kids, the finances, the fallout. It's going to get messy." Her words hung in the air, and I realized she was right. This wasn't just about broken hearts. It was about the practicalities of untangling two families that had been intertwined for years. Birthdays, holidays, even the simplest family gatherings. Everything would change now. We spent hours on the phone that night, talking through the details. Susan, like me, had a prenuptial agreement in place, one that would protect her assets if Rich was unfaithful. She had always been practical, and now that foresight was paying off. "I want the kids to know the truth," she said suddenly, breaking a long silence. I hesitated. "Are you sure? That's a lot for them to handle." "They deserve to know why this is happening," she said firmly. "But I want to do it carefully. We have to think about how to tell them without hurting them more than necessary." She was right, of course, but the thought of explaining this to our kids made my stomach turn. They were already dealing with so much. How would they react when they learned the full extent of what their mother and uncle had done? "We'll do it together," I said finally. "When the time is right. They need to hear it from us, not from anyone else." Susan agreed, and by the end of the call, we had a plan. She would file for divorce, and I would do the same. We would coordinate our efforts, ensuring that Bonnie and Rich couldn't manipulate the situation to their advantage. Before we hung up, Susan said something that stuck with me. "We didn't choose this, Rob, but we can choose how we handle it. We can choose to be strong for our kids and for ourselves." Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. They reminded me that, despite everything we'd lost, we still had control over our futures. And I was determined to make the best of mine, no matter how hard it would be. The next chapter of my life was beginning, and while I didn't know what it would look like, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Bonnie and Rich's betrayal define it. Filing for divorce felt like the final nail in the coffin of my old life. I'd contacted my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Claire who had a reputation for being thorough and unrelenting in cases like mine. As I sat in her office, surrounded by shelves of thick legal books and framed diplomas, I laid out the evidence I had collected against Bonnie. Claire flipped through the folder, her expression calm but calculating. "You've done your homework," she said, nodding approvingly. "This is more than enough to prove infidelity. Given your prenuptial agreement, you're in a strong position. She won't walk away with much." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. The idea of stripping Bonnie of her share of what we'd built together felt both justified and devastating. She was the mother of my children, after all, and no matter how much anger I felt, part of me still mourned the life we had shared. Claire didn't give me much time to dwell. "We'll need to focus on protecting your assets and ensuring custody arrangements are in your favor," she said, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. "How much do your kids know?" "They know something is wrong," I admitted, "but I haven't told them everything. My son, Jake, already suspects a lot. He and my daughter even uncovered some of the evidence I brought you." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Smart kids. But this situation isn't theirs to manage. We'll need to frame this carefully to avoid putting them in the middle." I nodded, grateful for her insight. She spent the next hour walking me through the legal process, how to handle joint accounts, what to expect in court, and the potential complications Bonnie might throw our way. By the time I left her office, I felt more prepared, though no less exhausted. The next step was telling Bonnie. That night, after the kids were in bed, I found her in the guest room. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn. "We need to talk," I said, stepping into the room. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of dread and resignation. "You've made your decision," she said flatly. "I have," I said, my voice steady. "I've spoken to a lawyer, and I'm filing for divorce. I suggest you do the same." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment she didn't respond. Then she looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Rob, I know you hate me, but please don't shut me out completely." The kids will always come first," I interrupted. "But this marriage is over, Bonnie. You made your choice, and now we have to live with the consequences." She didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, her tears spilling over as she buried her face in her hands. I felt no satisfaction in her pain, only a hollow sense of finality. The days that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings. Susan and I kept in close contact, supporting each other as we navigated the legal minefield. She had filed her own divorce papers, and like me, she was determined to come out of this stronger. Every step of the process felt like another piece of my old life being dismantled. But as painful as it was, it also felt like progress, a slow but steady march toward a future where I could finally breathe again. I knew the battle wasn't over. There were still hearings to attend, decisions to make, and challenges to face. But for the first time, I felt like I was regaining control. And that, at least, was something to hold on to. Breaking the news to the kids was brutal, but it had to be done. Susan and I gathered our children together, presenting a united front. Their anxious faces told us they already sensed something was wrong. "There's something you need to know," I began. "Your mom and Uncle Rich made choices that hurt both of our families. Because of that, things are going to change." Jake, ever perceptive, immediately understood. "It's the affair, isn't it?" he said, his voice laced with anger. Susan nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, your dad and I found out, and we're divorcing them." The room fell silent. Emily started crying, while Jake's anger bubbled to the surface. Susan's kids, Hannah and Luke, looked stunned. "We're so sorry this is happening," I said. "But no matter what, we love you, and we'll get through this together." The kids asked questions. Why? How long? What would happen next? And we answered as honestly as we could without overwhelming them. By the end, the shock had settled into sadness, but there was also a glimmer of understanding. As hard as it was, I knew we'd done the right thing. The truth was out, and now we could focus on healing as a family. The legal process began in earnest, and soon Bonnie and I found ourselves facing each other in court. Susan was in the same battle with Rich, and we leaned on each other for strength as the cases unfolded. Thanks to the prenuptial agreements, neither Bonnie nor Rich had much leverage. The evidence I'd gathered painted a clear picture of infidelity, and my lawyer, Claire, handled it with precision. Bonnie's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, claiming she had contributed to the household and deserved more than what the agreement allowed. But Claire countered with the facts. Bonnie had knowingly violated the terms of the agreement, and the evidence left no room for doubt. When the judge handed down the ruling, it was clear Bonnie wouldn't get much more than the 20% we'd agreed upon. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't about punishing her, but about ensuring the future for me and the kids. Susan's case followed a similar trajectory. Her lawyer dismantled Rich's defense, exposing his financial mismanagement and dishonesty. Susan's assets remained protected, and Rich left the courtroom with little more than the clothes on his back. After the rulings, Susan and I met outside the courthouse. "It's over," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Almost," I replied. "Now we rebuild." We both knew the legal victories were only the beginning. The real challenge lay in moving forward, healing the wounds, and creating a new normal for our families. But for the first time in months, I felt like we were on the right path. With the legal battles behind us, life began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of anger, sadness, and disbelief, but there was also a sense of freedom. The weight of Bonnie's betrayal no longer hung over every moment of my day. The kids adjusted slowly. Jake threw himself into school and sports, channeling his emotions into something productive. Emily struggled more, her once bubbly personality dulled by the upheaval. I made it a priority to spend time with them, to remind them that they were loved and that we would get through this together. Susan and I grew closer during this time. We leaned on each other in ways we never had before, sharing dinners, long conversations, and even laughter as we navigated our new lives. We both agreed to shield the kids from any lingering drama, focusing instead on giving them stability. Bonnie and Rich, on the other hand, were dealing with the fallout of their actions. Their professional reputations took a hit, as word of their affair spread through our shared circles. They moved to a different city, but even from afar, their strained relationships with the kids were apparent. One evening, Emily came to me with tears in her eyes. "Do I have to see Mom?" she asked. My heart broke for her. "That's up to you," I said gently. "I'll never force you, but I think it's important to keep that door open. No matter what, she's still your mom." Emily nodded, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. It was a reminder of how deeply these wounds ran, and how long it would take to heal. As the weeks turned into months, I started to rediscover myself. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, and even started going to therapy. Slowly but surely, I was learning to let go of the anger and focus on building a future I could be proud of. Susan was doing the same. She threw herself into her work and found new ways to connect with her kids. Watching her strength inspired me, reminding me that we were both more resilient than we had thought. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward, and that, I realized, was enough for now. A year later, life looked different, simpler, quieter, but also more peaceful. The chaos that had consumed my life after discovering the affair had finally settled. While the scars remained, they no longer felt like open wounds. The kids were finding their own ways to heal. Jake had become more independent, channeling his energy into college applications and sports. Emily, after months of therapy and heart-to-heart talks, was starting to smile again. She even agreed to spend occasional weekends with Bonnie, though their relationship remained strained. Susan and I remained close, a bond forged in the fire of shared betrayal. We had turned our pain into strength, supporting each other as we rebuilt our lives. Though we kept our relationship strictly platonic, it felt like we were more than just siblings. We were teammates in this new chapter. As for Bonnie and Rich, they were little more than distant memories. They lived in New Orleans now, working unremarkable jobs and trying to piece together their own lives. The kids rarely mentioned them, and when they did, it was with a tone of resignation rather than anger. One evening, I sat on the porch with Susan, a bottle of wine between us. We talked about everything and nothing, our kids, our jobs, even the weather. At one point, she turned to me and said, "You know, I never thought I'd feel happy again after all that happened." "Me neither," I admitted, staring out at the sunset. But here we are. She smiled, raising her glass. To starting over. I clinked my glass against hers. To starting over. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. The road ahead wasn't without challenges, but I finally believed it could be a good one. Life had broken me in ways I never expected, but it had also shown me the power of resilience. And for that, I was grateful.